So let's start with Q&A. So I think try and encourage students to put questions to Al first of all. But we'll turn to staff if we can't get anybody. So who's going to start us off?
I was just wondering, how does sort of the health of the different patients feature in the optimal mechanism? Supposedly the guys that are doing very badly should be prioritized relatively, and how does that feature when you design this?
That's a good question. We actually, for deceased organs, we actually do that differently in the United States for different organs. So for livers, the sickest patients are prioritized. For kidneys, the patients who have waited the longest are prioritized. But when you talk about the surgeons, they actually, there's a tough market design problem, because the transplant centers are sort of regulated by their outcomes, their risk-adjusted outcomes. And the idea there is, if there was some hospital where they were doing a bad job, if they were losing patients who they shouldn't lose, you'd like to close them down. But you have to distinguish that from hospitals that are taking very sick patients who are likely to do badly because they're very sick, and make sure you don't penalize surgeons for that. We're not doing that so well in the United States. So surgeons who have had some bad outcomes in a given year and are sort of given a red flag, they start to be more cautious about who they transplant and what kidneys they transplant. So what we're seeing is although there's a shortage of kidneys, the lower quality kidneys are being discarded at a high rate, because people, even though there are patients whose lives they might save. So that's an ongoing market design problem, how to regulate hospitals so that they do a good job but don't back away from taking risky patients. And we now have something for deceased donor organs. We have something called extended criterion donor organs, so organs from old guys like me. And if you're far down on the list, you can elect to be offered those organs. But if you're high up on the list, if you've waited a long time, then you should wait for a better organ. So we're trying to also move parts of the list that would take a long time to get a kidney of the usual sort. But there's lots of market design issues about that. We don't do that very well. And it's highly politicized. So it's hard to change the regulations. They have to go out for public comment. The care of patients with kidney disease is a $50 billion a year industry in the United States. So there are lots of institutions and interests. The changing national policy can be glacially slow.
Thank you. When considering the kidney chains, is it ever the case that they are stopped on purpose to help someone who does not have a donor?
Yes. They tend to be ended on purpose to give to someone who does not have a donor. And sometimes they're run as long as they can, and then you give, so as not to impose a long delay, as we did with that first one on the last bridge donor. Sometimes there's a person with very high priority, a child who's highly sensitized or something like that, and we don't really maximize the number of transplants. We maximize the weighted number of transplants, and some transplants have higher weight than others. So very highly sensitized patients are attractive to transplant, and sometimes they can cause a chain to end, particularly if they're under 18 years old.
So you talked about the repugnancy that kind of markets can lead towards. And I was wondering if the nomenclature you use and calling this exchange for kidneys already a market can lead to the slippery slope of the marketization and the commercialization. Like you also you call everything market design, and the thing with high school students and teachers and schools, like doesn't it lead already to the slippery slope? And yeah.
Yeah, that's actually a good question. It turns out, I don't know if you noticed, when I showed you the Norwood Act, which makes kidney exchange legal, they don't call it kidney exchange, they call it kidney paired donation. And that's because they have the concern that you have, which is, let's not call it exchange. That'll make people think of a market. So it's possible it will do that. And of course, that may or may not be a good thing. But as an economist, I have a broader view of markets than most people do. So I think that these matching markets, I think a lot of people's view of markets is commodity markets. You see the price and you buy it if you want it and can afford it. But of course, yesterday I spent time telling you about labor markets, and labor markets aren't like that at all. So I have a much broader view of markets, and I see no reason why we shouldn't call exchange, a computerized marketplace for exchange of kidneys, a market. And let's go back to Jevons. He talked about barter marketplaces and how difficult they were, and how money is a solution that lubricates the trade that couldn't be made in barter. Well, it turns out computerized clearinghouses do that too. So when you can build up a database and you can look for exchanges widely, we're dealing with the congestion. One of the things that makes barter hard is you have to find that double coincidence. It might be hard to do, but there might be some double coincidences, and there might be some three-way exchanges, and that might be others. So we're going to see more and more computerized marketplaces, smart markets, markets that use computation to do things that we couldn't do on our own without them. But as with all technological advances, we'll have to decide whether those are things we want to do or not. But I am not entirely sympathetic to the view that we shouldn't call them markets. I think we'll see them more clearly if we call them marketplaces, and then we can decide what we want to do about them.
Hi, thanks for your lecture. So this isn't directly about kidney exchange, but it's sort of about the content you talked about yesterday. In thinking about matching markets, I was thinking about the college admissions process in the US and the fact that we have like early admission, early decision, and then regular decision. And my gut tells me that that's not the best way to create stable outcomes. So I mean, I have a sort of two-part question. Do you think that in thinking about market design, that's the best way to design this market? And B, if not, what's the best way to fix this? Because a lot of top institutions are moving towards early admission or early decision. I was wondering, how does that maximize stable outcome?
So you're right, college admissions in the US is undergoing a kind of unraveling. It's not getting earlier and earlier, but a higher and higher percentage of entering classes are being decided early rather than late. And there's several kinds of early admission. There's single choice early admission, which says, apply to us early and we'll let you know early whether you can come or not, but you're not obliged. And then there's binding early decision, where you essentially write a contract. You say, I'm applying to you early. If you admit me, I promise to come. And these solve certain problems for colleges which have to control the variance of their entering class, because a college, I presume this is true in Britain as well as in the United States, but certainly in the United States, a college is not just an institution of higher learning, it's also a hotel. So it provides residences. And so variance is a concern. You don't want to admit more, you have to admit more students than you have room for, but you don't want too many more to accept, because then the inn is overbooked. And it becomes costly. You have to rent space to put up your students. So one of the reasons why colleges like early admissions is it cuts down the variance. If you know that half your class is already coming when you make the riskier admits, then you have less risk of too much variance. By and large, college admissions seems to work pretty well in the sense, and I think one of the differences between college admissions and hiring residents or even hiring professors is the elasticity of demand. A big American college that wants to have 1,300 freshmen can do just fine if it has 1,250. They can allow some sophomores to transfer. It can do just fine if it has 1,350. They can take some rooms that would have been lounges in the dormitories and convert them to bedrooms. So So each admit is not that critical in the way that it is for medical internships. So I don't know how inefficient it is, but what I know is that the colleges are not suffering from the inefficiency the way that the hospitals were in unraveling. And certainly one of the rules of market design is it's hard to get lots of people to coordinate on an entirely new way of organizing the market unless they're really suffering with the old way of organizing the market. So I don't see myself devoting a lot of time to trying to reform college admissions in the US, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of demand for that reform. It is doing some odd things. It's worth studying why it works the way it does and how it does, but I don't hear a lot of demand for reforming it that would make the prospects of successful reform high.
Thanks. So my question is probably going to be a bit more general than the previous ones. So yesterday you mentioned the fact that when you were asked to work in the matching market for medical students, most of the papers before you had to work in it had been rejecting the possibility of you being able to find this match for married couples. So what I can see, you've essentially gone from an empirical problem to theory and then to a solution. So and then you mentioned yourself that you're basically like an engineer in economics. And I can see that, I mean, you mentioned simulations as well. So you can see that there's a bit of a kind of scientific approach to economics that you're employing. I mean, in economics, it's not always like that. Quite often, people start from theories that are backwardly engineered and then fit those theories to empirics. So do you think that in economics, we should be moving towards kind of this causal, kind of an arrow between empirics and theory, rather than theory and empirics, kind of employing this more scientific approach to economics, in particular given the recent events, or do you think that we should keep it as it is right now? Given the recent events in the world economy and the inability of many of our theories to predict it, do you think we should be moving from empirics to theory and not the other way around?
So I'm not sure I've understood the question, but there's an interplay between theory and empirics in lots of different ways of doing economics, and certainly in the things that I do. You know, my first notion of kidney exchange, my first paper on what turns out to be kidney exchange was written in response to a paper by Lloyd Shapley and Herb Scarf in Volume 1, Number 1 of the Journal of Mathematical Economics in 1974. So a very abstract mathematical journal, and they proposed a very simple abstract model. They said, supposing you have a bunch of people who each are endowed with one unit of an indivisible good, and they would like to trade with each other, and they may not use money. And they called the goods houses. And the reason we like toy models like that in economics, so it's clear that that's not how we sell houses. I just bought a house and I used money. But here we were playing with this toy model of how you would exchange things if you couldn't divide them and you couldn't use money. And they developed a notion of cycles and chains, and later I studied it and proved some things about the incentive properties and things like that. But it was all abstract stuff. We called them houses, but of course that's not how you sell houses. But the same way children play with toys to prepare to become adults, we were playing with these toy models so that we'd be ready when someone asked us, you know, we've got these indivisible goods and we can't use money, how should we exchange them? We'd say, you've come to the right place. You know, we've thought about that. We weren't sure what it would be good for, but we now know what it's good for. You know, it's good for kidneys. So, and on the other hand, then, as we started to do kidney exchange, our models have changed a great deal. You know, that turns out not to be a great model for kidney exchange, but it did start us thinking about cycles and chains. So we started, on kidney exchange, we started with really abstract models. Then we saw a marketplace that could be built, and we helped build it. Then we started to get empirical data on how it worked. And we've had to change it. Our models today are different than our models were, partly because the players are different. So you know, it seems to me that the world is a wonderful source of inspiration for theorists, but that theory is also a good lens with which to look at the world. So I am not so, I understand there's some dismay that economists aren't better at understanding the world than we are. And I think it's natural that, I mean, it would be wonderful to understand the world better. You know, economics is a very early stage science. You know, one of the reasons it's fun to be an economist is we don't know very much about economics, so it's easy to learn something that nobody knows. But that's not a bad way for a science to develop. So, you know, think about biology and medicine. The really applied question in medicine, you know, the first order implied question is, why is there death? But no one is studying that. Because it's intractable, it's too far from the frontier. Instead, we're studying particular causes of death, particular diseases, and we're studying the metabolism and the molecular nature of cells. Those are pretty far removed from why there's death. On the other hand, we all live a lot longer than we did 100 years ago, right? Life expectancies have gone up. So even people who are working at the most abstract, you know, molecular level are contributing to a body of knowledge that turns out to have practical importance. And of course, at the clinical level, sometimes we don't even have good theory. You know, why is aspirin good for you? Well, you do clinical trials and you discover there are fewer heart attacks. So there's a whole array of tools that we use, and I think that's true of economics. Economics is just as broad a science as biology when you include medicine. You know, so the doctors are the guys who have to work beyond the reliable scientific knowledge to take care of patients right now. The molecular biologists and the evolutionary biologists are, you know, sort of the high theorists, you know, thinking about things that are pretty far removed from everyday concerns, but that we have every reason to believe will eventually be concerned. So we're an early stage science, but I think we have to try to do all of those things.
So this ends up actually being a good follow-up question to what you just said. So getting back to the theory of these compatibility graphs, are there questions that, like graph theory questions that you wish you knew the answer to that would make these exchanges more efficient? Or are there questions in graph theory that were inspired by a kidney exchange? So
there's certainly graph theory that I would like to see that I don't have. Right now, most of our graph theory results for random graphs come from a body of theory that Orosh and Renyi thought about in the 1950s. And they proved limit theorems. And limit theorems are very clumsy tools for people with empirical interest because we're always looking at finite-sized graphs. And the limit theorems tell us if the graph got really big, something would happen. And in particular, one of the things that happens in these random graphs, unless you're careful, is the graphs become very dense. They stop being sparse when they get really big. But we need them to be sparse because our graphs are sparse. So we have to, but we only have limit theorems. So we wish we had some intermediate kind of theorems that said, you know, what can we say about graphs where there aren't too many short cycles because it's very sparse, but you don't let them grow to a limit and get ridiculous conclusions. Instead, what we're forced to do is we're forced to use these limit theorems as tools, we're forced to let the graph get large in a way that keeps them sparse, which means we reduce the probability, as the graph gets larger, we reduce the probability that you can take my kidney, which is not a realistic assumption in itself, but keeps the graph sparse, and we need sparse graphs, and we only have limit theorems for them. So I wish we had theorems for, you know, telling us speeds of convergence and what happens in the middle, not just limit theorems. There are no limits in the world, right? A limit always says if the compatibility graph were bigger than you've got now, how would it look? And you'd like to look at graphs that are around the size you've got now. But that's hard. In a lot of areas, we only have limit theorems, not just graph theory.
Right, but limit theorem is actually quite recent as well, right?
Pardon me?
I thought that limit theorem, this graph limit theorem, was actually quite recent compared to...
Well, you know, no, Erder-Shreni are 1950s kind of stuff. They have thresholds above which the graphs have a giant connected set in the limit and other thresholds below which they become disconnected, things like that.
Hey, another quick question regarding the kidneys. So far we have considered, to my understanding, that every kidney exchange, that every kidney exchange bears the same value in a sense. Is that so? And I mean, there must be some consideration with regards to the health of the patients, right? Irrespective of the blood group and the tissue. And what implications does that have for potential market design where we introduce some?
That's a good question. Yeah. So let me answer your question not for kidney exchange, which has live donors and therefore involves all the aspects of exchange, which are complicated on both sides, but for deceased donors. So we have recently changed the way we're going to allocate deceased donor kidneys in the United States, and we are going to start to try to make the kidneys, the transplanted kidneys, live longer and therefore have fewer repeat transplants and cut down the demand. And what that means is starting to give kidneys with high predicted longevity to people with high predicted longevity. So because a live donor kidney has a half-life of around 20 years. And of course, not every patient will live that long, even if their kidney is good. So we're starting to try to match longevity a little bit. It's been very controversial. It's a change that is taking place it'll take place in January if it goes through as scheduled. And so that, I think, addresses your question a little bit of, are there matches that are better than others? And what you'd like to do, I think, in the long term is reduce the need for transplants as well as increase the number of transplants. And one way you reduce the need is giving people kidneys that will last a long time for them so they won't need another one. Giving people who are going to live a long time kidneys that will last a long time so they won't need another one so quickly.
Thank you. You spoke about some markets that might work more efficiently with money. You also spoke about some markets which were made illegal, i.e. prohibited, but that are still working kind of below the radar. Are there any markets which you are particularly passionate about maybe opening up, maybe making them more efficient with money, and is there maybe something you're currently trying to design?
You know, when I wrote my paper, Repugnance as a Constraint on Markets, because I work in kidney exchange, I know a lot of people who have very strong opinions on whether there should be a market for kidneys or not. Some of the surgeons who we've helped design kidney exchange have strong opinions, both for and against. And one of the best compliments I got on the paper was people with opinions on both sides said to me, you know, I thought you presented both sides of the argument very fairly. but I could tell that you agree with me. So, you know, when I started, so I told you today about victory after victory we had in kidney exchange. You know, we've figured out how to do two-way exchanges. We figured out how to do three-way exchanges. We figured out how to do long chains. Well, that's victory after victory in a war that we're losing. When I started to study kidney exchange, there were 40,000 Americans on the waiting list. And today there are 100,000. That's not all bad news. Partly it means we can keep people alive longer. Partly it means that there are fewer traffic fatalities, so fewer deceased donors. Partly it means that there's been a recession lately, and that makes for fewer living donors, because not only aren't there financial incentives, there are financial disincentives to give an organ. You might have to take 3 weeks off of work to give me your kidney, and if times are tough, then maybe that's not a good idea to do. So I'm a little bit worn down by the growth of that queue. And I am open to suggestions in how we should address it, but I don't know, you know, but when I talk to Gary Becker and I say, you know, you've written this article before, now you've got an article in the Wall Street Journal saying let's have kidneys, you know, kidneys for cash, why do you think it's going to work now? His answer was, you know, you can never tell. These things sometimes change quickly. Look at same-sex marriage. You know, you want to repeat the argument so that people are receptive to it when the moment comes. I'm not sure that that's the right way to go ahead. It might be that we should try to understand better what are the causes and see if we can work around them. So I just conducted, with my colleague Muriel Needley, I just conducted a representative sample survey of Americans on the question of different ways that kidney donors might be compensated. And one of the ones we talked about was, how would you feel if a Heroes Foundation started to give rewards for heroism to people who donated kidneys? Turns out that seems to go down easier than buying the kidneys, right? Rewarding the heroism. So, you know, they could give them a medal, but maybe they could give them something else. Maybe that wouldn't be repugnant. So I think that we at least have to explore those kinds of conversations. See, I don't know why there's a law against kidney sales everywhere, but the fact that there is an important thing to think about. So I think that probably saying, you know, I agree with Gary, we should have a market, isn't going to get us a market. So whether or not that's a good thing, we probably aren't going to move from where we are to there. And so I think that what we ought to be thinking about is how can we move from where we are to someplace where we would prefer to be.